Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Today we're going to ask a fun question. How many wives is best, or how many husbands is best? We're going to go to season number 1. That's where we are in the book of Genesis, episode number 38. We're going to go to a single verse, Genesis 4:18. We're at the 7th generation of humanity, starting from Adam and Eve, and then Cain and his descendants after he murdered his brother Abel. So we find that Cain is moving away from the presence of the Lord in kind of a spiritual geography as well as maybe a physical geography as well. So we're going to encounter God's design for marriage in Genesis 4:18, where Lamech took two wives. That's the verse. Lamech took two wives. So God's design for marriage is in the singular, not in the plural. In 1 Corinthians 7:2, it says each man should have his own wife. It's a singular word. And each woman her own husband. Again, a singular word. And then even in Ephesians 5:28, he who loves his wife, not wives, it loves himself. No one has ever hated his flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ loves the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his singular wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now that's Ephesians chapter 5, quoting the Old Testament and clarifying what the Old Testament is saying in Genesis 2:24, which is the big mandate to marriage. So polygamy is not God's original intent. It's mentioned here. It's endorsed nowhere in Scripture, and it's fought with peril, as we'll see in the life of Solomon. It's very clearly qualified as God's intent for a singular person to a singular person marriage in New Testament elders and in the life of the New Testament church. So let's just go over some of the arguments against polygamy. First of all, God instituted marriage and made it a one woman and one man institution. He realized it wasn't good for man to be alone, and how did he answer that need? With one woman, one flesh, not one fleshes. So there are many Old Testament heroes that had one wife: Noah, Job, Isaac, Moses, Mary and Joseph. And there are Old Testament examples that where the people that are in the Old Testament, they are not perfect people, which is one of the beauties of it, really. Very relatable. Solomon most prominently stands out of a good example of what not to do. So just because the Bible mentions a certain practice doesn't mean that he condones it. So to cite the practice of polygamy, like here in Lamech in Genesis chapter 4, is not to approve of the practice. It's very clearly established in the New Testament in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1:6. Being the husband of one wife is the qualification, one of the unbreakable qualifications for spiritual leadership into eldership. So the term in the Greek means one being a one-woman man, and in no way can a polygamist be considered a one-woman man. All right. So though the Bible does not expressly prohibit polygamy, in other words, if you're looking for thou shalt not polygamize, there is not that verse. But if you treat the scripture as a whole, you'll see that it's allowed, but it's never endorsed. And it's referred to here, even in the start of it, as Lamech here is moving away from the presence of the Lord. So you may say, okay, well, what about some Old Testament heroes who did practice this? Well, just because they practice this doesn't mean it doesn't make it right. It's never approved. It's never condoned. In fact, it's specifically warned against in kingship in Deuteronomy 17:17. In the qualifications for kings there, he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. So in 1 Kings 11:3, talking about Solomon, he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. Next verse, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David. So many wives brings many problems. It fractured Abraham's household with Hagar and Sarah, and Jacob caused espousal rivalry. It led Solomon to idol worship. Um, so just because it's mentioned doesn't mean it's endorsed. There is a provision in Exodus 21:10 which provides for, you can't abuse this polygamous system. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. So kind of like the divorce provision, it's set up for the protection of women and a concession to sinful man. So there is some regulation of polygamous marriage, though it's not, that doesn't mean that it's endorsed. So it doesn't also mean that God was ever pleased with polygamous marriage. So what are we supposed to do with polygamy in the Old Testament, as it's mentioned here? I think we should not be modeling it. I think we should strive to be a one woman man. I think we should strive to be a one man woman. Um, I think we should use God's original intent in marriage, which was always described as in the singular, not in the plural. And I think we should use the full counsel of Scripture, where the New Testament now sheds light and detail and explanation, if you will, to the Old Testament, which gives a light saying that this is not God's desire. So let's be a one woman man and a one man woman. And then come back tomorrow, and I think we're going to take one more look at this as we look how polygamy relates to modern day porn. Thanks for listening.